Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Payments Leaders Show. I'm your host, Adrian Evans, and I'm absolutely delighted today. This one's been building for being in the diary for a few months now. So, Ray McDonald, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. We've been speaking for a few months, and obviously we had the pleasure to get together recently. And we've got to thank our good friend Michael Harty when we connected
Indeed.
at the Card and Payment Awards, which is always a fantastic event. So I wonder if you could just take a little bit of time just to introduce what you do today, and and just tell us a little bit about your background, just top line before we get into the questions.
Okay, no problem at all. So Ray McDonald, I work in a company, set up a company about 18 months ago called R&D Payments Solutions. Pretty easy, R&D, Ray McDonald. It wasn't very creative, but that's the title we picked. At the time, we had a little vote in my family, and that's the one we picked. And ultimately, I worked in JP Morgan for the last sort of 18 years and left JP Morgan and didn't really know what I was going to do and decided to set up a company with the view to providing advisory consultancy back into the business world. Didn't really know what that was going to look like, had a business plan, but I suppose a year in or 12 or 14 months in, that's probably changed, and I know we'll discuss this over
Sure.
the next few minutes, but it's changed over time. But I'm married. I have three grown-up kids, so 30, 27, and 23, and all out in the
Yeah.
workplace rather. So delighted, and my youngest has just started her first job.
Excellent. Well, congratulations to her, and I know it's a great story behind that one as well. So I wonder if we could start though, Ray, was that if I was to show somebody your actual CV, they'd probably be pretty surprised that you left school at 70 and then went on a journey. So I wonder if you could break that down for us into the sort of chunks of starting in retail, ultimately then spending 17 years, sorry, at JP Morgan, 18 years there. So I wonder if you could just chunk some of that down for us a bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, probably not the path that someone starting out in their career would choose today. But at 17, I left school, discovered later on in life that I was dyslexic, and therefore that explained a lot with regard to my school and my performance within school. But went straight into the workforce. I joined a retail shop in the city centre, and then over the next probably 10 or 12 years, spent spent several years in different roles, gaining a huge amount of experience. And that experience would actually come into play much later on my career as well. So I worked in retail, I worked in procurement, logistics, also then in production on a production line. So again, learning all the aspects of how all the mechanics behind all these elements worked really paved the way for me later on in my career to being able to break down and understand how things work and then how to make things better.
Brilliant.
So, and I call that the first part, which is the school of life. The second part is sort of a realization. And I got to a point, where, I was 30 years of age, in a good job, but my, and starting a family, but my ability to get promoted in that career was limited by the fact that I didn't have an academic
Yeah, yeah.
background. And so I sort of realized if I wanted to progress the way I wanted to, I needed to get an academic degree. So did a business degree at night. So, and when you go back to those days, working 60 hours a week, then going, getting the bus or driving in and going to college 3 nights a week, it was a tough time, but actually really worth it. And learned so much about myself and so much about, how I could progress. Also at that time, I really started to look at my career and what I think that should look like. And the way I did that was setting sort of plans for myself or goals, 1 year, 3 year, and 5 years. And we discussed this before, is that if I hadn't have done that, a good example is one of my goals early on was I want to get promoted in the next year. Well, I got promoted within 18 months. If I hadn't have set that plan, it probably would
Yeah,
have been five. It probably would have been 5 years.
sure.
So that realization of what I wanted to do and take my career uh, really, really seriously was a real wake up for me. And and worked very well for me. And then finally, I think the third part, which I think is really important, is looking at the impact. And I think, I mentioned COVID as we go through this, but COVID was really interesting in that people stood up and said it's okay not to be okay. And that
Mm.
drove a lot of about mental health. It's okay for people to talk about mental health that didn't before. And I know we'll get into this later when we talk about, diversity and culture, etc. But that was really important to me as well, is understanding where I was and then understanding how I can help others potentially. And that could be top down, bottom up, and also drove a lot more activity for me around mentorship. And that was both for me and for others as well. Huge believer in mentorship, and actually a really interesting point about mentorship. I've always sort of picked people that were slightly difficult as mentors,
Okay.
rather than someone who sort of says, okay, I really like Adrian, will you be my mentor? And then we high five each other, every quarter and everything's wonderful, versus having someone who sort of questions what you do and how you
Yeah.
do it. So turning up with a belief that you're great, and then someone, your mentor, saying, well, I wouldn't see it that way, is really, really positive
Mm.
and a really good way of learning.
Amazing, amazing. Sorry, there's so many angles we can go down and avenues we're going to go down here that are of interest. But I'm going to stay on script just for the time being with our questions, because I think this is going to be an interesting one. So you got to the point with JP Morgan where sort of you then became MD and ultimately across Europe for client management and sales. And ultimately you were responsible for $10 billion worth of client revenue. Yet during that time, what is it you were most proud of for the impact you had on merchants, but particularly on the payments ecosystem? We've got a wonderful ecosystem in the payments industry, which is very much based around all boats rising. So I'm fascinated about the impact now.
Yeah, so I sort of break it down into uh, the first piece is around learning. And I think, my first day in Chase Payment at JP Morgan, I sat down, came from outside the payments industry, and I sat down with a payments guru at the time. And we were a very small office, not many people there. And he handed me a chargeback manual, which was in a lever arch fold with 156 pages. And and I went through it, and I don't know how many times I read it, and I was like, oh, what have I let myself in for here? Like, this payment stuff is, but ultimately what it did do is, and not just from the chargeback perspective. So one, I was an expert in chargebacks within a few weeks, right? So which was great, right? So, but the other part of it was it actually taught me that there's so much to learn in this world,
Mm, mm,
that having that knowledge base was so important. And it's a really interesting question. One of my mantras was that if I'm talking to a client and they ask me a question and I can't answer it, well, then that's an opportunity missed. And I take away ownership for probably for a problem versus an opportunity. But if I can answer it, well, then it just goes away. So I think the learning aspect of my career has been really important in that if I can understand the basics, well, then it allows me to and helps me makes decision at a much higher level. I think the other piece I'm really proud of is that winning and winning is important, but not just a big deal. Winning a small deal, some of the smallest deals we've won have been probably the best feeling
mm,
walking out of the room, because being up against the competition, coming up with a solution that nobody else has, and then winning that deal, and potentially that client becoming a much bigger client over
mm.
time, has been always something that I've really looked upon. And I think lastly, I'll talk about advocacy, and I think that's been really important. And advocacy around the client, so that we had a great little saying is that the merchant is at the center of the table every time I went into a meeting, so that we can talk internally about how we want to do things, but how does it impact the client and how does it impact the consumer? And I think that advocacy is not only external but internal as well. As I just discussed, the external piece just as important. When we look at the payments ecosystem and how big it is, you've got schemes, you've got banks, you've got PSPs, acquirers, cyber fraud, etc. Advocating on behalf of your client within that ecosystem is something I'm really proud of. and a lot of the changes that we were able to make, and whether that be with issuing banks, whether that be with negotiating with schemes on behalf of a client, etc. Lots of different avenues that we went down to make it better for our clients and our consumer is something that I'm really proud of.
Brilliant, brilliant. So in terms of, you've been described as somebody who both strategically focused, but also operationally excellent at execution and getting things done and getting things done in the right way. We hear a lot these days about being data led, but it seems to me that data has really been at the heart of your career and the decisions you've made. I wonder if you could give me an example of where you've used data in a different way to unlock or to mitigate risk, to unlock an opportunity for a client and a customer, or to enhance a customer experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, so my love of data was well before I joined a bank, right? So
Okay.
back in my Maxtor days, and Maxtor is the disk drive manufacturer, and the example I'll give is that really early on in my career when we were all dealing with spreadsheets and everything went through spreadsheets, I sort of really understood quickly that, the automation of tasks was really important. So that if you could automate a task, an example I gave, it takes an hour to, pull all these files together. Automating that hour into 1 second, which we did initially at the very start, was okay. Well, now this is really good, right? So now I have those 59 minutes to make decisions and interpret the data versus actually pulling it all together. And that progressed into pulling down. I had 4 people on a Monday spend all their day contacting warehouses all over Europe with what the stock was, how much stock was taken in and out for the previous week. So automating that task, those 4 people then spent all day Monday interpreting the data so that we could look at the next 13 weeks planning for the factory. And the difference was we used to spend half an hour at the end of the day coming up with the interpretation because we didn't have all the data together. But by automating, so then machine learning came and all those data analytics came. But 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 really it was the understanding of how data can help drove me
Mm.
to, I suppose, always having a data question, and
Yeah.
then, working from that to that just-in-time environment, and then, really being able to sit down with data analysts and the data analytics team, and to sort of sit down and say, well, if that report is monthly, why can't I have it weekly? And if that report
Mm.
is weekly, why can't I have it daily? And if it's daily, why can't I have it hourly? And by the way, why can't I just have it dynamically?
Yeah.
That I can see what's going on. And in the payments world, that's where we've got to now, where
Yeah. Yeah.
now we can see that the authorizations as they happen, which is really, really important. So I think the data piece of that, and I think the value that data drives, and especially today in the world where, a merchant has choices and they will have several PSPs or acquirers, that they process transactions through. Data allows, for me, data allows the incumbent, to increase their share of wallet. So it's
Yeah.
not about winning all of the business. It's about how do I move from 50% to 51%. And I apologize to any of the teams I worked with in the past because the 1% was always a big thing with me, which was I don't want us to move from 50 to 70. I want us to move from 50 to 51 because 52 will come if we get to 51. So how do you drive that share of wallet? And data
Okay.
was the key for me.
So I'm picking up a couple of strands here. Is it so I can relate to a lot of these myself? This is how I believe in that incremental next step. But I'm just fascinated, particularly with your career. Um, how important as being dyslexic, but then ultimately finding a way. And again, I'm partially dyslexic, and so our brains are wired differently. I believe brains are pretty well wired for human connection and relationship building rather than, and they don't tend to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How important has that been for you unlocking and going, hey, in the workplace, this is the big impact I can have, particularly in leadership of a large financial business?
Yeah. So I'll first say is that it was an embarrassment for me and
Mm,
something
yeah.
that I didn't really feel comfortable admitting. I
Mm,
saw it as a disadvantage,
yeah.
for a large part of my career. And thankfully, I had a inspiring boss who actually, when I sat down and I was chatting through some stuff with her, it just came out. It came out with a view to, sort of, hey, well, actually, and her reaction is the one that always I remember. Her reaction was, that explains it. That
Yeah,
explains why you
yeah,
see
yeah,
things differently.
yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah,
and then it started to, I started to think back to conversations I had, and I remember having a conversation with a senior person in JP Morgan, and again, she came back to me. She said, "I love the way you approach these things because it's
yeah,
just
yeah.
different, right? So you have a different angle. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. But the angle that you come at is really important because it gives us food for thought. So I think from that perspective, I think I really, I got to embrace it, and I got
Nice.
to admit it. So, and by the way, I still can't spell, right? So that's
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the other part of it, right?
Snap.
So,
Two of us. Yeah. No, it's wonderful because for me, if I could just say, I think we need that inspiration from somebody, don't we? That says that's okay. I understand you, and by the way, that's okay, and this is what we can do with it. Oh wow! And then you see it's a point of difference
yeah.
within your career. It can make an impact, particularly with client relations and problem solving. Did you find that particularly the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and they're the examples I sort of give when we're sitting with a client, and I think even in simple areas where, my QBR would be a good example, the quarterly business reviews, where, uh, my thought process would be slightly different in that I'd approach it in a way of saying, well, let's not measure ourselves on on how they want to measure us. Let's measure ourselves on how we want to be measured as well. And let's make sure that we represent that in the room with the client. And I think that became really important
Mm,
because you start to talk about things that the opportunities and the advantages that we're bringing to the table aren't necessarily described in the quarterly business review you get
yeah, yeah.
from your client. So it's how you're able to manipulate that conversation around making sure that everybody sees the value of us in the room and the value obviously of the client as well.
Absolutely. I'm smiling here because my quarterly business reviews were pretty similar about actually what's the collective piece here and what do we want and how do we integrate those behaviors to best serve our clients and obviously best serve the stakeholders moving forward as well.
And I think that, there was also, a mantra that I had, which was, this is the easiest way for us to win business. If we match what they measure and if we exceed in what they measure us against, well, then we become number one, and we become that
Mm,
first phone call when there's a new opportunity. And that's all you can ask for. If there's a new opportunity that the client has and you get first dibs at that opportunity, well, then it's yours to lose, right?
yeah,
So, or yours to win. So I think it's really important that you sort of, rather than say, oh no, here's a QBR and I'm not doing well in this area, you say, well, actually, I need to be the best in the field in this area because that's going to win us more business, and it's going to be better for the consumer on the client side because they're going to have a better experience.
yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, that moves us quite nicely because obviously you've been described as a culture carrier where you've leaned in significantly to women on the move, advocating and getting men as allies, then the 30% club, the also well-being, etc. But obviously, all of this is at the same time as running a very significant P&L and a large number of people to keep motivated and keep on track and run an effective business. What is it that made you lean in so deeply into that?
So I think firstly, it's a really good point, and it's something I for many years I brought up at annual reviews with people, right? So, and you sort of, I think about why someone's employed. Why was I employed? And that core role. And if I can do that core role well, it allows me to do other things and other opportunities that come that are probably outside the core, but are maybe interesting to me or interesting for the company I work for me to do. So ultimately, the first thing I concentrated on was how do I make sure I'm good at what I'm employed to do.
Right.
But secondly, then what other areas would I like to be involved in? And that became, diversity and inclusion became a huge thing. And for me, inclusion was just as big as diversity. And it came from ultimately when I look at, you know the experience I've seen, I've worked for some brilliant women in my career who had to do abnormal things to get to the position they got to, because if they were a man, it would have been an easier path. And I think the what I wanted to, when I looked at it, I said, how do we make this a level playing field for everybody?
mm,
And that includes, not necessarily just the diversity piece, but the inclusion and the examples, especially as men, as allies, we did some excellent work with women on the move. But it's thinking about how do we get managers? So if you bring it down to a very tangible
mm,
level, how do we get managers of people to make sure that they manage everybody in the room the same way? So we all know we go to a meeting and you've got the person who speaks a lot. We've got the person who sits in the corner and doesn't speak. Well, how do we get the person in the corner to speak? And it started with that sort of motivation, right? So that motivation to hopefully have a level playing field, but also have people who just because they're quiet doesn't mean they're not very intelligent and don't have a contribution. So how do we get them? Because then everybody benefits from their contribution, the individual, the company, and the manager themselves as well. So I think, and again, when we think about COVID, we think about all the things that we looked at doing during COVID, which were, I suppose, a little bit abnormal before COVID, which was like, okay, let's have Zoom free Fridays was one of the initiatives we did. No Zooms on Friday. No, so that we gave everybody that time. We gave everybody time. If you want to walk and talk, you can have a meeting walking down the street, and we won't care that if there's a car beeping or whatever that is, right? So all the things, all those initiatives that we brought in were very important for the culture of organizations. And I think what we needed to do is, my motivation was how do we change that at all levels? So, at top down, bottom up, and sideways. And I think through the women on the move, through mentorship,
mm.
and just through general conversations of I don't know how many times I've people come up to me and say, "Can I have a chat?" And being available to sit and have a coffee with somebody,
Mm.
didn't work with them, just knew them, as part of the organization, and trying to be able to help them in whatever they were trying to do. And that could be just a simple bit of career advice, or it could be an issue that they're having at that moment in time.
Wonderful, wonderful. Look, I'm totally, this is how I'm DNA. This is what I believe in. And I see the value of cognitive diversity and not just demographic diversity. I do feel though at the moment there's this whole sway where many people think this has gone too far. I hear regularly, and they think, yeah, these are nice to haves, and this is sort of soft focus. So I wonder if you could just give the business case for diversity. What's the impact that having more diverse minds, having those people in the room who aren't the loudest, what do we hear about? So there's so many examples I can give, but I don't want to do them. Is what's the business case for inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, I will say one of the things I didn't mention, but what I think is important is that it's not a one-way process. So listening is so important, and just as a sidebar, one of the things that we did, we set up uh, 4 different sessions in 4 different countries. Exactly, I was one in London, and we brought in a selection of people, asked them to come into the room and tell us their experiences, and it's a true, when I was thinking about this conversation, it's a true story that some of those, and I won't mention them, some of those examples of what people had to go through brought tears to everybody's eyes in the room, right? So, and I think to answer your question is that having people who, number one, have a voice
Mm,
and are not afraid to use that voice, and that can be in a positive form or a negative form, doesn't really matter, but having that voice, I, I think the benefits for the company are huge, right? Because if you have, you take it down to in the room that we talked about in the meeting, you have somebody making a good suggestion that's going to drive an initiative that will drive that manager to talk to their manager, potentially, and you bring that all the way to its end conclusion, which can be a benefit to the organization. And that can be reputation wise, it's not about revenue. It could be reputational, it could be revenue, it could be operational excellence, lots of different areas, right? So I think by having that more open opportunity for
mm,
people to discuss, it opens the door for new ideas. And how much money do companies spend on bringing everyone together? You know, 5,000 people in Vegas, for a kickoff meeting, right? So, but why not do it in the room where you have 10 people, where you can create something in that room that can then filter up into something that's good?
Mm, yeah. I never thought about it like that, but it's those smaller clusters become multiplying effects. I think one of the other interesting ones for me is, well, potentially is, well, just understanding customers more. The more if you've got people from a diverse background, and you're trying to every company is trying to find new growth areas. Well, that means by definition we have to explore customer bases that we don't really understand today. So we need new voices who can come in and understand at a very straight line revenue perspective. If you understand a particular country or a particular demographic or what that may be, and what's the opportunity within that, that voice can just expand revenue channels to top line revenue, mitigate risk, reduce transaction cost. It can do all the things why businesses exist.
Exactly, yeah, and then it can be as simple, and it goes back to my earlier point of client is at the center of the table.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that everything that you do reflects around the client and not just around some internal project that somebody had an idea? And that can be that small voice in the corner saying, well, why are we doing this? What does this, how does this benefit? And everyone goes, oh yeah, okay. I didn't really think of that way. So yeah, I agree. I think ultimately every organization is trying to satisfy their clients' needs, but at the same time satisfy the requirement uh, of of their employees, and
Mm,
satisfying their need as well. And
yeah.
and I will say I've been lucky to work in bigger organizations where the employees do have a voice,
Nice.
and have the ability to use that voice if you have the if you have the courage to go and follow that path.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So obviously you've moved through JP Morgan. You started, let's just say, in retail, went into production line. So if you were to, what led you then to form the business today, RMD, and what gap did you see in the marketplace that you're addressing? And I know you're very prominent throughout the payments ecosystem, and you're a judge on very prestigious awards as well, and you're highly connected with them. But what was the gap? Do you think there's still an opportunity here for me to add some significant value?
Yeah, I think, we talk about AI today and AI, and I think everything's catching up uh, very, very quickly. And there's been a huge explosion in complexity. So
Yep.
we think about how a payment is processed. Well, actually, the underlying ecosystem hasn't really changed that much, right? So you've got legacy platforms, you've got interchange, you've got issuing banks, you've got interchange, you've scheme fees, you've got PSPs, acquirers, fraud, etc., right? So, but the explosion in that complexity has driven a lot of organizations to question how they manage payments. And payments have sort of become cool, where they
Yep.
weren't so cool, 15 years ago, they're really cool now. So with that no clear ownership in organization, it's starting to become much more owner focused within the client base. And what I mean by that is that traditionally you had maybe a payments person looking after payments if you had one, might have been the CTO or the IT
Yeah.
department,
Yeah.
might have been finance or the CFO, and ultimately treasury at some point. What we're seeing now is that complexity has been reduced within the client base. So now you've got a treasurer saying, well, I'm really interested in how this money comes in. I'm really interested in, the mechanics around that and the optimization of that so that I can get more money in quicker or quickly, but also not have to pay exorbitant money to do that. So again, things like FX have come to the fore. So I think for me, when I look at organizations, and that could be at the enterprise level where they're getting to grips with this, but they've got all this data and now they're saying, okay, well, what do I do with it? Because it's all coming from different places. It's difficult to interpret. And I've come up with some homegrown, or I'm relying on my incumbent suppliers to give me that information. So I think there's a gap there. So from a point of view of my experience being able to help organizations, and I'll say at enterprise, but especially at fintech, and that world where somebody has an idea, they grow, they're accepting payments, and they're too busy to look at exactly what that means because at the front end, they're trying to generate revenue for the company. So they move from 10 to 50 million to 100 million, but they're still using the same
Yeah, yeah.
payments when they started. And there's a lot of opportunity to optimize that. So, and again, I think that's a great opportunity for me.
Wow. So I'm hearing there, is that almost like a, I'm sensing this from you that a skill of yours seems to be able to make the complex simple or to make the complex more digestible. So I'm almost feeling like your role is taking your accumulated knowledge and almost translating it to be able to make it almost palatable and say, actually, you're driving the business here, but actually what I can do is show you how to mitigate risk, how to drive transaction costs, and actually get. So is that the sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, I will talk about, later on about advice, but I think it's asking those questions that people find difficult to answer.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is you sort of go into the room and it's like when you start a job and you go in and you say, well, how's that work? And this happened to me in payments when I came into payments, especially, right? And I'd say, well, how does that work? And everyone would say, well, that's just the way it is. And I said, no,
mm,
but how does it work? And I
yeah,
was like, well, just
it
move
does.
on. And it's quite interesting. You sort of go, well, okay, well, it's not just me that's been silly. So my value in the room is driving that conversation and asking those hard questions, but also have the ability to say, well, actually, you know what? You are doing this, and parts of it are very, very good, but parts of it you've got other options and I can help you with those other options. And that
Mm,
optimization, and especially when you look at optimization, I look at it two ways. I look at the front end and the consumer, and how do you optimize revenue at the front end, but you also look at the back end and you look at cost optimization. And how do you do that? So what are you paying? Are the transactions, going through the correct flow? If they are, then is there a better way of doing it potentially? And is there more a cost-effective way of doing it as well?
mm,
So all of those things, and I've been lucky enough to probably have worked in most of those departments over the time. So, from sales operations to technology to sales to relationship management to partnerships, etc. But also heavily involved in schemes and issuing as well, right? So looking at, what happens at the issuing bank stage has a material impact on the consumer, whether that transaction is approved or declined. And under the client transaction, well, then there's a massive amount potential opportunity in that small little part of the ecosystem to
mm.
make it more efficient.
No, I like that sort of end-to-end approach because, to say, the payments industry has become far more headline and actually become pretty cool. And that's because I think the people are realizing that the sums that they're dealing with. And I suppose that somebody said to me the other day, quite interestingly, which was that everything ends up in a payment. If we're in
Yeah.
business, everything does it, whether it's a coffee, whether it's a multi-billion turnover FX transaction, cross-border payment, everything ends up in a payment.
Well,
So moving,
sorry, I'll just quickly add to that actually, because I think when you think about, and we've touched on AI, but you think about where competition is coming from. So 10 years ago, the barriers to entry into the payments world was huge. It was about platforms, it was about hundreds of people, it was about coding, all of those things. You move on to today, and you've got two people sitting in a room creating a payments platform within a short period of time. So I think the ecosystem has changed, and a lot of clients are starting to look at that and saying, well, actually, there's potential for us here to be smarter about how we do our business.
mm,
Will it
mm,
will it change from, the legacy banks and Visa, MasterCard, etc., alternative method of payments? All of that is to be seen. But ultimately, I think the opportunity today is to understand your business and to be able to optimize that business because you've got much better options today than you had 5 years ago.
it's frightening actually with AI. I think um, I've really been doing some AI projects myself recently, and I set myself on a 90-day sprint. And but I said I'm going to right size a project and ultimately build a workflow. And it's staggering what it can do when you get the right level of human interaction at the beginning, human interaction at the end, and an AI doing the heavy lifting in between. I firmly believe that human intelligence and AI, when they combine together correctly or efficiently, can be quite remarkable whilst keeping humans in the loop, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and I know, listen to some of your previous one, especially with Dylan and Keane as well, right? So people buy from people, right? So and I think that's a really important factor in the decision making process.
Absolutely, and I don't think I think the roots to those relationship. It's interesting for me, but I think the earning the right for dialogue, which is what we were talking ultimately about with Key and Dylan, just earning that right for dialogue. But getting those signals is one thing, but enhancing the human to human connection, that's not going anywhere.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So moving towards the future, whether it's you know 2030 or 2020 2035. What does the CV look like of a payments leader then? And what are the things they're going to need to have adapted to, adjusted to, and evolved proactively? What advice would you be giving to those people?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer the second part of it first. I think, you know, and ultimately, I think we talked about earlier on, no such thing as a stupid question.
Mm,
So it's okay to ask a question when you don't know the answer. It's okay to ask it. I think the next piece is that the consumer is the most important cog in the wheel. So don't lose sight of that. Fail fast, interesting concept. Uh, I think a lot of people like to talk about failing fast, but actually failing fast is quite difficult to do, right? So when you invested in a project, but I think it's when you start to see, and I think AI will help us do this, when you start to see that maybe we're going down the wrong path, it's quite easy to change and to pivot from that. So I think failing fast is gonna be important. I think respect and trust is absolutely paramount. We talk about people, people buying from people, but respect and trust, if you have that, it's so important. And actually, as especially as people go through their career, as a manager, you have to learn how to trust people because you don't have all the information. You're trusting people that give you the information, are giving you the correct information. So it's really, really important. I think AI, adapting to AI and being very capable and efficient in AI is going to be hugely, hugely important. Uh, I think the final piece I think is really simple. Is that whatever you're doing, give it your best,
mm.
uh, and have passion for everything that you do.
Wow. Wow. Well, Ray, this is the point where I try and bring together a summary here, but I've got pages of notes here. So I'm wondering if I could just try and summarize, I think, some of the most salient points from our conversation. Would that be okay?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
I think from the start of our conversation, I think the fact that you didn't have what I would consider a classical career or a linear career, I think that just shows just what's possible. And actually, I think some of you talked at the end there about having passion and having purpose, but also having and respect for individuals and trust, but actually setting goals out for yourself and not sort of realizing that you've reached your potential and actually saying, okay, there's a barrier here for me getting promoted, or but what's the workaround here? We can guarantee it's going to be a load of hard work, but let's be smart about it. And I can only imagine just how much there was, starting a family, deeply involved in a business and going to night school. I can only imagine what those three key things were like. But I think that just if there's any sort of hope or inspiration people can take from that, now I think that's a really great start. I think the other thing, obviously, sort of fellow dyslexic here, I think the fact that see your dyslexia as yes, of course, it can be seen as a disadvantage, but actually, there's plenty of people in the world who turned that around and made that that as a desirable difficulty, to quote Robert Bjork, a desirable difficulty that actually gives you a point of difference compared to many other far more linear thinkers or far more people who only think with very strong critical skills. I think the big thing for me was then how you went about managing and putting, is a constant one. Put in whether it's the merchant at the center, put the client at the center, but like who's the most important person here, and how, what relationship are we built with them? But let's never forget and let's return to that. obviously, I think the big piece for me was about not just managing such a significant, a large business, but also saying, okay, who's not included here? Not just from a fairness perspective, but whose voice are we not hearing that actually could be valuable? That could be valuable and having multiplying effects across our business that actually could positively impact the reputation of the company, but also a client at the center of this. Well, what impact could that different voice have on a client and lifting that other individual up? I think then in terms of the opportunity then we looked at was still with the bank of value you have, you still see it ultimately the payments ecosystem has got cool, number one. The environment is still, however, an infrastructure still actually pretty similar to what it has been for over half a century. Obviously, the complexity's got more difficult, but there is a space I was feeling there for those translators, and obviously including yourself there, who can break that complexity down. But I love the piece as well. We didn't mention the word, but it runs through the whole. Everybody who's on this comes on this show curious. Nobody's ever been on this show who's not curious. And like you're saying to people, how does that work? Why does it work that way? Let's get interested. And it's interesting. I had another guest on recently. I think chargebacks is one of the starts of all great payments careers because I think it's seen as pretty unsexy. Yeah, people master charge because obviously payments flow to go one way. Yep. That's how the
Yeah,
whole system's built. It's not flow to come back the other way. But I think if you can master, for me personally, if you can master chargebacks, then I think it means just how much passion you've got for the environment, for your for the ecosystem, and for customers too. But I think just sort of coming towards the end there, just making it all really focus is, of course, we want to win. Of course, we want to win. But what allows us to be in the winning position with clients and customers? It's it's relationships. It comes down to respect and trust, and you build trust by doing what you can do and what you say you're going to do. But that's about waking up each morning with a passion. And actually, also another common theme throughout all of our guests is actually doing your best, whatever the task may be, actually giving that your all and focusing on giving your best. Because the truth is, that's all we actually have. We don't, there's no 110%. There is just giving all. So they were my takeaways from our conversation.
perfect. Yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate it, and I think really enjoyed the conversation, but really enjoyed the thought process beforehand, and
Yep.
revisiting areas that I haven't gone to for a long time.
Nice.
It's been great to think about, and great to think about those experiences, and yeah, delighted to be on the podcast.
Well, Ray, I just want to say thank you so much. I know you put so much time, effort, and consideration and preparation. It clearly comes that's why you've been successful in what you do and how you do things. So it's been wonderful to have you on as a guest, and I very much appreciate all of your time, your effort, and your insights and your wisdom.
Excellent. Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, have a good day.